Did you know, did you know that kids today have to pay sometimes to get into spelling bees? Now, I say this with a certain sense of very personal violation because you are not just listening to the host of the Zero Hour. I will have you know that you are listening to a former sixth grade spelling champion. As anyone who was around in Genesee County in Utica, New York, in the 1960s would, of course, willingly attest. The winning word, in case you're wondering, was cotton. 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 Now, and was I as obnoxious as any sixth grade spelling bee champion might be presumed to be? I like to think not, but others would have to judge for that. Now, our next guest has written about what's going on with the spelling bee industry, dare I say, along with a number of other topics that are of great interest to me. I always enjoy talking with her. Helaine Olen is an opinion writer, a contributor to Post Opinions. She is also a writer on finance and the author of such books as Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry, and the index card, Why Personal Finance Doesn't Have to Be Complicated. She's been writing on a lot of great stuff lately, including spelling bees. So without any further ado, Helen, or rather Helaine, thanks for coming on the program.
As long as you don't call me Helaine, I'm fine with
Yeah,
it.
I don't know where the Helen came from, actually, but it doesn't matter. Now, as long as I haven't offended you, it doesn't matter. Um, Now, I was amazed by your piece. Now you can pay to play at the National Spelling Bee. And I'll tell you why. As funny as it sounds, back during my brief moment of glory in the dawn of the modern spelling bee era, there was actually a whole kind of culture around the spelling bee. People, I wouldn't say my family or me, but people took it seriously in the sense of it was the purity of the game, and you did it with integrity, and it was all about the talent and the ability. Now, we could talk about the fact that clearly there was probably racial bias built into it in terms of access to certain types of education that contribute to spelling bee skills and that type of thing. But and there were no doubt it was problematic from the start. But all that said, there was a sense of, well, you don't. It's not something you can buy. It's there's an ideal behind it. And so when I read your piece, I was kind of surprised that people can buy their way into it. How did that happen?
This is an incredible story. And I should say, to be fair, this was broken by the Wall Street Journal. What happened is the spelling bee, the Scripps National Spelling Bee, decided to deal with a certain unfairness. And the unfairness is that because of various changes in the way it's been organized in the past several years, the certain kids from certain states have better chances of making it to the spelling bee than others. So if you're in Ohio, you've got like 18 spots, and Georgia has one spot, right? And I think we would all agree this is sort of unfair. But the way they decided to deal with this, instead of reorganizing the spelling bees, is to allow people who came in second, third, fourth, whatever, sort of to pay a fee and get in anyway. So who didn't win at the regional levels, right? So the second runner up, the third runner up. I just want to say this right up front. I want to make it clear, not any random rich person can buy their kid's way in, right?
Right.
But it's so if the kid does have to be a serious competitor. But that being said, this serious competitor could have never won at any of the regionals. It could have never won at any of the sub-regionals and still get the invite and pay their way in. So they did this last year, and the fee was, I think, $750. And as it turned out, the ultimate winner was actually one of the kids whose parents paid $750.
Yeah.
This year, they allowed over 200 kids in this way, actually more kids in this way than have won at the regional level. So they now have over 500 kids in the spelling bee, where they used to only have about 200 something. And the result and they doubled the price of admission. It's $1,500. And by the way, you have to pay all your costs of coming, which are also covered for the people who get in the more traditional way. And this is their way of addressing what they consider the unfairness of the geographic distribution. I would say we've just created another unfairness. Now these kids, what happens to some smart kid whose parents don't have $1,500? They're out of luck. The response to the spelling bee is maybe they can fundraise it or they can get somebody to sponsor them. But that's not exactly, again, wealthier people tend to have access to stuff like that.
See, and you put your finger on a lot of. There's a lot that's wrong with it. First of all, starting out with, and I say this also, I was not deeply stressed by the experience of being in a spelling bee. Other kids were. It was. I realized later it was traumatic for them, and my parents made the decision not to have me continue on to the regionals because, or whatever the next level would have been, because they didn't want that pressure put on me, and I think they made the right decision, frankly. But so I start prefacing with, I'm not even sure the whole thing is a good idea. I kind of don't like I get nervous for the kids if I watch. But having said all of that, you rightly point out that this decision to solve the problem of the geographic unfairness this way is deeply ideological in a way that I'm sure the conference organizers, the competition organizers didn't realize is it deeply reflects some of the poison, I would call it, of contemporary ideology. You wrote, Helaine Olen, you wrote, quote, "There is no society in existence anywhere where money did not confer some privilege, but in the United States we are forever finding new privileges available for purchase." This to me, and people may laugh at me using a word like this for a spelling bee, it's a neoliberal solution.
It is. This is something that has become a real issue in our society. It feels like everything comes with an up. So when we were kids, for instance, if your parents had some money, you took Stanley Kaplan classes, right? To study for the SATs. Now people with money hire private tutors for this stuff. And that goes all the way back. When New York City tried to expand out its gifted and talented programs at the kindergarten level to encompass more minority kids from lower incomes, they promptly got gamed by parents who were hiring private tutors for 4-year-olds for these tests. And we see this just across the board. We see, African American children are suspended from school at higher rates, are more likely to go to prison. You could go on and on. But the fact is, in our society, money confers an enormous amount of privilege, and we just simply don't acknowledge it for the most part.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that we also see market solutions as the answer to problems of access and affordability and the distribution of resources. And I think in its own small way, I think this National Spelling Bees solution, purchase a spot for $750. Well, a lot of people wanted to buy it for $750. We'll make it $1,500 this year.
Right.
That's
That to me incredible, by the way. I just have to say that part to me was one of the parts that really stood out. Oh, we had so much demand. Let's double the price and let more people in.
Right.
And it worked, by the way. On one basic level, they were right. It worked. But on another basic level, you're kind of like, what the heck? This isn't like an okay way to run a society.
No, it isn't. And I think I applaud you for bringing it up. It made me think of something I've thought about writing about. I don't know if anyone else has, but some of the passes for like in Los Angeles for high-speed lanes during rush hour and how the costs
I should have
spike.
thought of that. I should have thought of that. Yes.
It's the
They
same,
have them
right?
in Virginia too, and they go up sometimes to like $60 and $60. It's absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, and that to me is really outrageous. So, and I'm going to transition since we were going to talk about a lot of things. Helaine Olen of the Washington Post. We were going to talk about a lot of things. I'm going to transition, and maybe you'll sense or intuit why of your multiple pieces here. I go to this one. You recently wrote about Andrew Yang, and Andrew Yang, for those people who don't know, is a businessman, a Silicon Valley type technology entrepreneur, likes to call himself a problem solver, is now running for president and you described his agenda as a TED Talk version of politics. So first of all, before we go into that, what is it that made you think of the TED Talks?
It was the idea that there would be an easy-ish solution to this stuff. Essentially, Andrew Yang's pitch, and I should say, I think Andrew Yang himself is really well-meaning. I don't think he's some terminally, he's, a one-trick candidate or something. His idea is that AI, artificial intelligence, is what's driving the unemployment in our economy. It's driving the income inequality. And therefore, he has this 100-point plan, the centerpiece of which is universal basic income. He's got other parts too. I mean, he's got free marriage counseling, free financial planning. I mean, he has all sorts of stuff, right? He's anti-circumcision, though I don't think that's part of the actual 100 plus point platform, and so on down the line. But the UBI is kind of the centerpiece of this. And his idea is that we're going to have to give people an income because they're not going to have work in 10 years. This is his response to our massive surge of inequality, basically. But the thing I found TED Talkish about this is that in Andrew Yang's telling of the story, this sort of happened to us. Technological progress, happened, and therefore inequality grew. And it doesn't really seem to reckon all that much with how the wealthy bought the system away from the rest of us, and how as much as, so it's not just that artificial intelligence allowed for a certain number of jobs to get wiped out. This is absolutely true. It's also that this was done to us in a lot of ways, with offshoring of jobs, with jobs paying less than they should, with monopolization, and so on down the line. And his critique really doesn't deal with that much. He kind of acknowledges that people in Washington are out of it, that people in Washington don't get it, but that how this happened doesn't really seem to come up. And to me, that's kind of a perfect TED Talk in a way, because that's, a sort of problem with a sort of easy solution that doesn't really require, tons of people to lose out. In fact, it's a complicated problem. There's loads of different solutions. And one of the solutions is going to be that the population who goes to TED Talks is probably going to have to, give up a huge chunk of their power and money to make, our inequality go away. And so far, they've been unwilling to do that. Therefore, here we are talking about it.
Yeah, and in case you haven't guessed by now, the reason why I drew a line connecting the spelling bee story and the Andrew Yang story is because to me, they both say, well, we don't need to be left or right. We don't need to confront this fundamental issues of the day. We can come up with a creative solution, quote unquote. And the creative, Andrew Yang, I know one of his slogans is neither left nor right, but forward, which is, sounds good to people it sounds good to, but whoever they are. But when you think about it, you don't get to duck the tough choices. You don't get to, if you run the National Spelling Bee and you want to open it up to kids in Georgia, you may think you've come up with a clever solution, but you're ignoring an underlying problem of inequality if you make parents cough up $1,500. Instead, you should accept more kids from Georgia. And if you're Andrew Yang and you think the solution to, his solution, and we can talk about the UBI and all those sorts, the universal basic income and all those things, but it's premised on the notion not only that technological change has worsened inequality, but that it will continue to worsen inequality, that we can do nothing about it. And therefore, the problem to be solved, not left, not right, but forward, is what do we do with the 85% of the population? It's 85% according to the economist Tyler Cohen, who's kind of the guru of this group. What do we do with the 85% of the population we've now rendered useless? Now, I've talked to Silicon Valley, prominent Silicon Valley people who say that confidentially at dinners and things like that, this is a big issue for them. What do we do with all the people we're making superfluous? And that to me is ducking the question of why do we want to permit a society to develop and remain in place that renders most of its population superfluous. I mean, that was a long
Right.
soliloquy on
No,
my
no,
part,
I
but
agree. And one of the things that always astonishes me in the UBI argument is that nobody talks about why are we working so many hours? Could we be paid to work less hours? And where are all these people going? We're not going to have robots taking care of people's, dogs if they're at work, or elderly people, or teaching in the schools. In fact, they tried in the past few years, sort of online learning, and it's actually turned out to be a rather resolute failure. It doesn't really work very well. And so there's actually this huge need for people, but they're not being channeled properly. And that's because of decisions that have been made fairly high up to either not pay these jobs properly, not fund them, not provide enough of them, and assume that the rest of us will somehow either volunteer our time or pay up in some way to make good on it. So again, there's no real engagement with what is a fairly difficult problem, which again goes back to the spelling bee, where they did kind of the same thing. There wasn't a sense of, oh, okay, how do we deal with this? How do we fix this? How do we set up more, competitions and get them funded? Instead, we're like, oh, we'll just make people whose kids are competing pay more money should they not win, which, is again just inherently trying to shove the problem onto somebody else and not dealing with the bigger issue.
I think that's 100% correct. And it also, and I thought about this reading your piece about Andrew Yang. When I was a kid, there used to be TV ads for a product called Mrs. Paul's Fish Sticks.
Oh, yes.
And the ads used to say, and I should use this in a piece somewhere, I just haven't done, but the ads used to say, they're great, Mom, the kid is saying to the mother, because of course it's the mother who heats them up. They don't have that fishy taste. And I remember my best friend Billy and I were fascinated by the idea that you would want to consume a fish product because it didn't taste like fish. And Andrew Yang is that way with politics, right? He's like saying, it's going to be politics, but without that politicky taste. And the fact is, to me, politics is politicking. You don't get around the fact that there are winners and losers in an economy, in a society, in a political system. And the question is, how do you treat those inequalities most humanely and most fairly to everybody involved, which is an inherently political process. So it seems to me that there's a sort of escapism to the candidacy of someone like Andrew Yang and to the followers of Andrew Yang. Say, oh, no, we don't have to have that politicky taste in what we do. We'll just be creative problem solvers, which actually leaves the fundamental problems in place.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that was what I found of the people I went to. So I went to an Andrew Yang rally in New York, and that was definitely what I found. I mean, I interviewed over a dozen people. I would say only one person was what I would call, engaged with politics on a meaningful level. And admittedly, this could have been luck of the draw, but that seems to be everybody's experience when they talk to Yang supporters. Is that you get a lot of people who stumbled onto him not through traditional political means, but through Joe Rogan's podcast, through the Breakfast Club, places. And I'm not knocking those places. I don't mean it to sound like that. But the fact is this is, a sign that if you hadn't heard of him elsewhere and you're hearing about him here, you're probably not that engaged with policy and politics and what it all means. They're not even hearing about him on Chapo House, say. So it's not like some alternative place to hear it. You're hearing it in a place where generally you wouldn't expect to hear politics, basically. And then I found, when I would talk to people, a lot of them said they had supported Sanders. A lot of them, frankly, hadn't voted in the primaries. Some had. Took them a minute to remember. I mean, again, I remember I voted in the primaries in 2016. I remember I voted in the election in 2016. I don't have any fundamental doubts about that.
No, I'm
2012, ditto 2008. I mean, I remember it quite well. And I'm not knocking them for not being political because most people aren't. But what I'm trying to point out is that this is appealing to that crowd. Usually, politicians appeal to the political and bring along the non-political, right? That's how it follows. Yang is sort of trying to do the reverse. And I think you can see the result of that, which is where he roughly stays at 1-2%. It's sort of appealing in one level, but it's probably not going to get much beyond this certain cult group, because ultimately you do need to deal with politics.
Right. No, absolutely. I think we're saying the same thing. And since we're dealing with politics, Helaine, Olen, opinion writer for the Washington Post, you were brave enough to engage in the topic of identity politics, which is sometimes a minefield for some people. And you quote that Stacey Abrams, who I believe actually won her election, or would have won her election if it hadn't been stolen for her in Georgia, Georgia Democrat at the Center for American Progress, where I believe she has a position now, actually, called for Democrats to embrace the quote unquote identity progress label. And you wrote, the notion of identity politics has been peddled for the last 10 years. It's been used as a dog whistle, she says, to say we shouldn't pay much attention to the new voices coming into progress. I would argue that identity politics is exactly who we are, end quote. Now, I have a number of thoughts about that quote, but you wrote about yours. And why don't you summarize them so I'm not the one
Well,
doing it?
so this was at the Center for American Progress's annual Ideas Festival last week, and Stacey Abrams was the first speaker. And it was a very good, compelling speech. And I kind of thought about it as I sat there all day listening to speaker after speaker. And at some point, it occurred to me that the way they think of, we're kind of thinking about identity politics in a wrong way, in a way. We're sort of insisting, oh, I have the right to be involved. I have the right to be involved. I have the right to be involved. And in fact, we've got it backwards, because we actually have a very narrow, small group in power, especially now with the Trump administration. And and we don't really point out how much that's identity politics too.
Sure.
That was what I was trying to say, is what we do is, older, white, wealthy male, not Jewish, right? Not,
Right.
and this is also an identity group. I mean, we don't think of it that way, because they're the ones in power. They're the ones traditionally in power. They're the ones who've always been traditionally in power. And therefore, that's the norm of what power is. And in the way you live with a norm, you just don't think about it. I always have a joke, real social change involves like people not even recognizing how it was before. Well, in this
Right.
case, there really is no before, but the point is that this is so how it is. We don't go, wow, that's identity politics too. But in fact, it is identity politics, and the fighting back, the cuts, and the intense cuts Trump's trying to get through in Medicaid and food stamps, and how the voting rights violations and the abortion attacks and the attempts to make it illegal. I mean, this is all a form of identity politics, a form of I've got mine and I want to keep power. And I think it's really important to think of it that way. And when you do, you start thinking about this all in a sort of almost in a way that feels upside down. And one of the things that really struck me when I was at the conference was when Tom Steyer was talking about all the polling work he's done on, and others have done on climate change and global warming. And he said, in fact, Latinos are the group most likely to say this is a real issue for them. And I thought, really? Like, I'd never heard that before, because you always think of it now with millennials, right?
Right.
And in fact, I went and looked it up. And yeah, there's a lot of polls that show this. This isn't just one random poll that found this weird result. This has actually come up again and again and again. Not something we think about very much, is it? But in fact, they are impacted by it. They live in poorer housing. They live in, Latinos tend to live in areas of, if they tend to live in poorer housing, they tend to live in areas of the country like California that are very impacted by this, and Texas. They receive less help. Puerto Rico, they receive less help. I mean, you can go on and on. And this is identity politics. When you give more help to people in Texas who have suffered a hurricane than people in Puerto Rico, you're playing identity politics and should be called out for it. Instead of allowing people to just say, "Oh, I want trans rights." Oh, that's identity politics. I mean, it's all identity politics.
Well, and I think, it's a fascinating, it's an important way to reframe it, Helaine Olen, and I appreciate you doing that. And I think you're absolutely right. I'd have to read Stacey Abrams's entire comments to understand where I think she was coming from, but I know exactly where you're coming from. And one of the reasons why I said that identity politics can be a minefield, especially in social media, is because I think there is a segment of the population that tries to divide the natural alliance that should exist between oppressed groups, let's say minorities, and other groups that are associated with what we call identity politics, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and so on, people of religious minorities, try to divide that from class politics as if in some way they were power politics, as if in some way they were separable,
Right.
which they are not, in my opinion.
No, they're not separate at all. They're
And
incredibly entwined. And I think the other part is, you know, the the sort of radical slash almost wackadoo edges sometimes get a huge amount of attention for various reasons. So I always think of the child at one of my children's schools a few years ago who protested, who came in and said, only Japanese people should eat sushi.
right, right.
And you're like, no, that's not it. But when somebody says something like that, it gets an inordinate amount of attention.
Right. And then I guess only Jewish people can eat bagels and I can only eat half.
I,
So,
I, I was about to say, I mean, that would be terrible if we could
right,
only eat gefilte fish and bagels.
right.
It would be
And
horrible. And we'd all die at 30 because we'd have heart attacks. It would be awful.
and but no,
Say the world's worst cuisine. Can we be honest for a minute? I'm sorry, I'm digressing.
right, no, but you make a valid point. But I guess so. This split, right, which is the exact opposite of what was originally meant by intersectionality, and I think is sometimes consciously used, and that's why I like your framing because it kind of clarifies all of that. The fact is that this particular identity, white, WASP, male, uh, wealthy, has used its power to make life better for itself at the expense of the other groups. It suddenly becomes more clear that intersectionality when you present it this way, when you invert this whole identity politics paradigm. What it also does is it kind of casts a light, in my mind, on the people. There are cynical, let's say, people who would preserve the status quo with all its benefits for the white and male and so on, and are not above using members of other groups to do so and say, well, if you oppose them, you're
Right.
against women, you're against people of color, whatever. Whereas really, it's just another ploy by a small group to keep that small group in power. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and we do all get defensive. I mean, there's no question about that. We can all get defensive at times. So I get that too. But I was really, that was what sort of struck me sitting there. I was, we've been dealing with a major exercise in identity politics over the past several years, and we're simply not identifying it as such, which might be the ultimate victory of that form of identity politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to think that's true. And identity politics feeds into your millennial piece as well, which I really enjoyed because I've been defending millennials for a long time. But the last thing I guess I would mention is, can Joe Biden's Nostalgia Act work? You compared him in music to the Nostalgia Acts from music, and I guess there's, Foreigner right now, the rock group is doing I think is on tour, making a lot of money singing "Feels Like the First Time," but it's not the first time.
No,
It's like the 500th time. And so I guess the question is, uh, what do you think in the couple minutes we have left? Could the
what do I think? I
Nostalgia
think
Act carry the day for the Democrats this time
we
around?
already have a nostalgia act in the White House. Why on earth would anybody want to replace it with another nostalgia act? I mean, I think this is a real issue that needs to be grappled with by the Democrats. I mean, I've actually been tweeting a bit about more it too, so I've advanced a little bit beyond the piece, but I should write another piece actually. But the issue is essentially is that Trump is in his mid 70s, is older, is sort of stuck in a time warp of the past, And Democrats, if you go by the polls, are essentially proposing replacing him with somebody who could be best described as a gentler, kinder version of Donald Trump right now. And I mean, there are real substantive differences
Yeah, that might be a
between
little
Biden and
harsh
Trump,
even.
but the
That
fact
might
of
be
the
a little
matter
harsh
is,
even for me,
Trump's
but
grossly inappropriate with
yeah,
women. Biden's sort of inappropriate with women,
right,
right?
right.
Trump's an out and out grotesque racist. Trump said Biden. I mean, I said Trump, right? Is out and out grotesque racist. Biden's had his issues in the past, frankly, and we can go on about this. And in Democrats, the feeling seems to be is, oh, this is how we lost in 2016. We have to find our own version, though nobody seems to really be articulating it that way. But that's kind of the impetus going on here. And at the same time, there's this feeling of let's go back to the Obama years. Obama was wonderful. Obama was this. Obama was that. And it's, looking back with some nostalgia, frankly. I mean, the Obama years were certainly okay. And compared to now, of course, yes. I mean, it's like being in paradise. But in fact, the Obama years are also what led us to this past. Trump. I mean, Biden, when he spoke in Philadelphia at his announcement, said things like, "We rescued the economy." In fact, the stimulus wasn't large enough, and we didn't. The Obama administration really didn't help a lot of people with foreclosures the way they said, and it's one of the reasons why we got Trump. At another point, he called back to bipartisanship. And I have the way to show you to bipartisanship. Look at Biden's record. In fact, his entire idea of bipartisanship is basically rushing to the right and carrying water for corporate interests over a 30, 40-year period. He's the one who, changed the bankruptcy laws to make them more favorable to creditors so that student loans couldn't be excised in bankruptcy. Supported, the criminal justice reforms that, have sent so many African American men to prison and so on down the line. And I have a very hard time believing that this form of nostalgia can sort of trump Trump's nostalgia, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Should he be the nominee? I want to put it out there. I'll vote for him. I would do everything I can, obviously, but I'm a little concerned at this point. It's the old Rudyard Kipling line. The gods of the copybook heading said, "Stick to the devil you know." It's, I have my doubts as to how many people are going to give up one nostalgia act for another one.
Yeah, I guess if you made me vote for REO Speedwagon, I might do it. But I think your point is just I take your point, and you beat the nostalgia act analogy a little more. I guess I would say, people, the 1%, they do go out to these concerts, right, and spend $500 a seat, $1,000 of skybox or whatever. But these acts, these old nostalgia acts, nobody buys their new records anymore. The 99% aren't listening.
Yeah,
So
and I have to say, I go because I'm an old Gen Xer, and I grew up with, parents who are 20 years older than me. So I saw both Art Garfunkel and Paul Simon last year. I took my parents, and
not at the
I
same,
wasn't
not
the
on the
only
same
people
night,
there.
though, apparently.
Sorry, and I'm sort of youngish, but like, old Gen Xer. I'm not that young. It's, I guess I have my doubts, basically.
Well, yeah, and understandably so. So, all right. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But as always, Helaine Olen, great to talk to you. Helaine Olen, again, is an opinion writer for the Washington Post, as well as the author of such books as Pound Foolish. And Helaine, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me on.